Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a quick sort of watercolour sketch of my local beach, Hove Beach, looking towards the harbour bar at Shoreham Harbour on a sort of grey day. So I'm starting off with my Milford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board. My board's at an angle of about 45 degrees. And I'm first going to paint wet on dry, starting off with some raw sienna and my number 6 squirrel mop brush. I want to try and create a sky that's very grey but still got some sunlight sort of coming through in places. This is a mixture of indigo and paynes grey. Just going to use that for the sky to start with. It looks very dark when it goes on, but it will dry a bit lighter than that, and I'll also spread it around with some water a bit more, just to lighten that up and grey it down a bit. I'm working it between the areas of raw sienna, picking some raw sienna up on the brush for some nice soft edges, and leaving some nice hard edges with a few sort of white sparkles. Thinning the paint out, bringing it down towards the horizon with more water so it becomes paler and smoother. I'm just pushing the paint around a bit with my squirrel mop now, trying not to introduce too much more water into the mix because I don't want to make any nasty sort of cauliflowers or runbacks, which is what happens if you go in with wetter paint onto a wet wash. Now a clean damp brush just to keep smoothing out the horizon line. You can see it's becoming a lot greyer now. I like working on cotton paper when I'm painting with watercolours because it stays wet for quite a long time and it's very much more forgiving than pulp papers. You can adjust things a lot more. You've got a much larger window for painting wet in wet because this has now become wet in wet as the area of sky is all covered with wet paint. When I first started painting with watercolour 3 years ago, I used to use pulp paper, which was, some of it was lovely, but it was much harder to paint on. When I finally tried some cotton paper, I was quite surprised at how forgiving it was and how much easier it was to get the lovely watercolour effects on it. So I would highly recommend cotton paper. Just adding in a little bit more raw sienna, making sure I've dabbed my brush out on a cloth before introducing the paint onto the sky so I don't put too much water in. Still using my squirrel mop brush, I'm going to bring that same blue-grey colour across for the wet sand running from the harbour on the horizon through to the main part of the beach. I just want it to sort of look like low tide with just a few little waves sort of lapping up against the shore. Trying to straighten off my horizon line and adding some of that grey colour into the sea so it's all fairly harmonious. Next I'll sweep some of the raw sienna into that little corner of beach at the bottom on the right. Just soften the horizon line a little bit where my harbour bar is going to go and my breakwater. Next I'll mix up a medium consistency mix of Payne's grey and just start to introduce a few darks while it's all still damp and wet, so that the darks diffuse a bit into the paint that's there and soften. That should give me quite a nice underpainting. And while it's still wet, I'm going to carefully try and just get a few dark shadows into the water area as well. I'm trying to be as loose as I can, trying not to fiddle and fuss too much. Just want this to have quite a sort of fresh, loose feeling to it. The sky is completely finished. I'm not going to touch that again. I'll just allow that to dry and soften a bit as it is. If I was to go in and make any adjustments now, I would probably ruin it by making some strange looking marks. Just strengthening up on the horizon just over there on the right, because as I say, there's going to be quite a dark breakwater there. I'll just clean up around the edges with a tissue to make sure there's no danger of any sort of bits of paint or little pools of water running back into the painting and creating cauliflowers. And I'll just feather my clean damp flat brush through the paint around the edges just to sort of soften things in a little bit. I'm keeping my strokes horizontal. And once I've done that, then I shall just leave it to dry completely and then come back and carry on. It's all completely dry, so now I'm going to carry on, and the first thing I'll do is I will paint the distant land. And here you can see it's a lot of West Sussex, from Portslade through to Shoreham and Worthing in the far distance as the coast curves around from Hove. Being careful to keep it very thin and straight across the horizon so that it gives the impression of being in the far distance. Sometimes you can't see this far. On a clear day you can see even further. You can even see Worthing Pier at the far end of that distant coastline. Darken it up in a few places. I'm going to have a much darker breakwater right in front of it though, just here, so I'm not too worried about how it looks on the right. With my small calligraphy brush, using a nice rich mixture of Payne's grey, I'm going to run some shadows, if I can, under those small waves that are coming in and lapping on the shore. My calligraphy brush has got quite a good point. I probably need to soften that back a bit. It's all looking a bit harsh at the moment. And now I'm going to load up my large harky brush with some raw sienna. I'm going to try and get some dry brush across the beach. But I'm afraid I forgot to switch the camera on for the first part of the dry brush, but here's the rest of it. So I'm just trying to get that kind of sort of hit and miss, little bit of yellow ochre sparkle there. just working in and around those small little waves and the water just coming in at the water's edge. Just dabbing off a bit where I've got too much paint. I'm not very happy with the way this is shaping up actually. It doesn't seem to be, I can't seem to get it to work as well as I want it to, but I'll keep going and see what happens. Softening back a little bit, getting rid of some of the paint that's maybe a little bit too dark there. I think I'm fussing with that area a bit too much. I'm going to leave it alone now and get on with the beach. I want to introduce some burnt sienna into the beach using my flat brush and using it to build up the shapes of the shingle and stones. There's lots of like grey and brown stones. They're flints and all sorts of things like that on the beach at Hove. So really I'm focusing mostly for this on this kind of reddish brown and black and grey. Just going to keep the shingle mostly in this foreground corner. And swapping around using the Paynes grey and the burnt sienna and using the flat brush, mostly the corner of the flat brush, to drag along these kind of flat-bottomed shapes, if you know what I mean. So it looks like the rounded stones, pebbles and shingle, etc., that are just sort of sitting flat on the beach. And then using my small calligraphy brush, I'll just try and get a little bit more shadow, see if I can get it to look a little bit more sort of, I want dark but subtle. So it's a difficult balance that I'm not finding very easy to get at the moment. So maybe I'll try and sort of get some darker marks in the sand here, try and get them looking like there's stones and seaweed and things like that. See if I can just balance up this composition a little bit more with some just loose brush strokes, something and nothing really. If you do some loose watercolour sketching like this, it's a great way to experiment, and if everything doesn't work all the time, it really doesn't matter. I mean, I'm not aiming to create something necessarily that great. What I am trying to do is to practice and experiment and to try out different effects. And that's part of the fun of watercolour sketching. And I'd encourage you all to have a go at that and, you know, just to sketch and experiment without necessarily having something in mind as an end product, but just to be enjoying the process. Now I'm taking my flat brush and I'm carefully putting in this very dark breakwater. Just using the tips of the flat brush and trying to keep it quite evenly painted across and taking it off the tape. And there's another breakwater just slightly closer to us that we can just slightly see a little bit more of it. So I'm going to bring that down carefully, not too far. I just want it to be a few millimeters lower than that first one. And then there'll be some sort of a beacon and a railing on that jetty. So I'll put in the upright for the beacon now and put the detail in a bit later. The beach is almost dry, so I'm just adding a bit more to it with some slightly darker, richer paint. Just dotting it around here and there, trying to keep it nice and dark right on the tape, so the foreground is nice and dark. with those touches of red. I'm now using the flat brush. It's clean and it's damp, and I'm just going to run it through and feather through the dry paint a little bit, just to soften here and there. I'm now going to use my very fine, I think it's a number 1 rigger, and just paint in the tiny railings on this large jetty or breakwater in the distance. And now the beacon. Just putting a little bit of shape, sort of like a baskety sort of shape at the top for the beacon. And while I've got the rigger, I'll see if I can improve things over here in the water a bit more by running some fine lines. But I think that's all a little bit too much, really. Not sure what to do here. Just soften it back a bit, I think. I think I've probably overworked this little area here by getting a bit hung up over it, but never mind. It's one of those things, you can sometimes get that with a painting, and I would advise against it. It's better just to get something to a stage where it looks okay and then leave it alone. Whereas here we are, I'm fussing around even more with the flat brush and trying more darks. What I'm trying to get is that really dark shadow that you get under waves, and I just can't seem to get it today. I think sometimes it's a fine line between being too dark and not dark enough, and I'm just not finding that middle point, but I think I'm nearly there as far as I'm going to get it without completely spoiling it. So I think I'll just soften it back one more time. And I think maybe I can just take a little bit of attention away from that area if I use the tips of the flat brush to run in a little bit of horizontal burnt sienna. That links it with the colour of the shingle on the beach, but I think it also just takes away from the overworked area of water on the left, I hope anyway. Right, I'm going to call that finished now, because if I keep going then I'll end up making it even worse. So I'm going to peel off the tape, see how it looks with a nice clean white border. That can often give us a fresh look at the painting. Now that actually looks okay. It looks a lot better than I was thinking it would look. So for a quick sketch, I think that's okay. But I think I need to practice my waves a lot more. So thanks for watching, and thanks for sticking with me, even though it was a bit torturous watching that at the end. But hopefully you've learnt something from that to walk away and leave something rather than keep fiddling with it. So thanks so much for watching, and thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon then. Bye.